Du Fu, the Chancellor of Shu. For the Chancellor's shrine, where should one look? On the outskirts of Chengdu, where cypresses grow thick. On its steps, emerald grass gleams, wearing spring only for itself. Screened by leaves, a yellow oriole sings, its lovely sound unheard. 3 humble, imploring visits yielded a plan for world order. 2 reigns he founded and assisted, showing his faithful heart. He led the army out against Wei, but died himself before victory. At the thought of it, brave men will always shed tears. So we get to the section of this heptasyllabic regulated poems block with poems by Du Fu, and he is the best represented poet in this section. He has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 12, 13 poems, all in all. So the best represented poet in this section. Heptasyllabic meter, we've already mentioned it, in a regulated poem is quite a daunting task. It's mainly used for court poems. It has an extra difficulty over a pentasyllabic poem in that the parallelism, if it is done properly, the antithetical parallelism between the characters from one line to the next one, it's a considerable tour de force. It's not easy to follow the strict categories of antithetical parallelism, of contrasting maybe a character for sight or for viewing in the first line with a character for smelling or for hearing in the second line, or a character for some weather phenomenon in the first line and a character for a different weather phenomenon on the second one. But Du Fu, who is a master craftsman, is recognized as a master of parallelism and of making it always seem relatively uncontrived. Okay, so we've already talked about Du Fu a lot in previous poems. He is the most well-represented poet in this anthology, arguably the best poet of all Chinese literary history, definitely of the Tang Dynasty. So, just some background. When he is writing this poem, Du Fu, this is in the immediate aftermath of the An Lushan rebellion. From previous poems that we read, you heard how he walked around the heartland region after the capital was taken, how he ran away, how he managed to escape and rejoin the imperial court in exile of Emperor Suzong, and so on and so forth. Then he went back to the capital, but he didn't stay much in office. He was pretty promptly sacked. And so after that, he basically roamed all through China without ever getting an official appointment again. So in this period, let's say 759, 760, one of the regions he stopped was in Shu. Now, Shu, modern Sichuan, is a region that we've talked about. It's in the west of China. Its main city is Chengdu. And during this time, it was under, or during the time Du Fu was there, it was under the rule of a scholar official that had served with him at the chancellery. So he was quite happy, and he got some protection and patronage from this governor. And he lived in the outskirts of Chengdu in a little hut, and he spent some time there. So he probably composed this poem early into getting into Shu, into getting into Chengdu. He would have liked to visit the main sites of the region, and one of the main sites would have been the shrine, the temple to Zhuge Liang. We've already encountered, so who is Zhuge Liang, who appears in this poem? We've already talked about him because there was a previous poem by Du Fu, I believe, The Ancient Cypress, in the section of 7-word old-style poems that was about another temple dedicated to Zhuge Liang, not in Shu, but in another region. And we've also read a poem about the king of Shu, that is Zhuge Liang's patron, Liu Bei, written by Liu Yuxi. But very quickly, let's summarize the story behind this poem, the historical background or the literary background. Now, when the Han Dynasty fell at the beginning of the 3rd century of our era, China was fragmented into 3 kingdoms. The Northern Kingdom, which was the more powerful one, controlling the Yellow River Valley, the heartland, the old capitals. This was the state of Wei under the Zhao dynasty. To the south or southeast, Sun Quan became the warlord controlling this area, and his kingdom was called the Wu Kingdom. And to the west, including Shu, but also some portions of the west of China, not included in Shu, the upper course of the Yangtze and of the Han River valleys. In this area, the person who became the governor, the ruler, was Liu Bei. Liu Bei was a scion of the Han Imperial Dynasty. So, he was a warlord, and he managed to achieve a relative degree of success thanks to the help of an officer he recruited, Zhuge Liang. So, this story, the story of the three kingdoms, of Zhuge Liang as the loyal, brave, intelligent, successful warlord, Chancellor of Liu Bei, managing to allow for the survival and expansion of this third kingdom of Hanshu against the much more powerful kingdoms of Wei and Wu. This became a legendary story. So this is based on historical facts. It's not a fantasy. But it very soon, started to give rise to legends, stories, romances, which distorted a bit these facts. Already in the historical chronicles, this distorting element is starting to take place. So one problem traditional historians had when analyzing this period is a topic that was very important in Chinese imperial history, which was in periods of disunion, which was the legitimate dynasty, the one that could be considered the legitimate continuator of the dynastic tradition. And specifically in the period of the Three Kingdoms, this becomes, a very controversial topic that was discussed long and in great detail, both in the Tang and in the Song, and even in later dynasties, I believe. So a priori, the idea would be, and many people thought, that the Wei dynasty was the more legitimate one because it controlled the heartland and the Yellow River Valley. It was the most powerful one, and it was indirectly the one that in the end managed to absorb the other two states. First, there was a usurpation, and the minister, one of the ministers of the Wei dynasty, usurped the imperial throne in the north and started a new dynasty, the Jin. And this Jin dynasty managed to conquer the other two kingdoms. In fact, already Shu had been conquered, I think, by Wei before that. Another position, on the contrary, and this in fact became the more popular, was that the legitimate successor of the Han dynasty was the Shu Han state in the west, in Shu, the state of Liu Bei. And the reason for this legitimacy was partially because the continuation with the imperial line of the Han was stronger here. I mean, the ruler of Shu Han was a collateral member of the Han imperial dynasty. So in the romances, this was in the histories, but also in the popular narratives about this period, the most popular of which would be long after the Tang, the novel of the Ming Dynasty, Romances of the Three Kingdoms. But before that novel, you also had plays, operas that talked about the topic. And in all of these stories, generally this second point of view that I've mentioned had been taken. The idea that so Cao Cao, the founder of the Wei dynasty in the north, is generally portrayed as a Machiavellian villain and as a bad guy, which is not altogether honest. He was, a pretty good ruler in his time and place. And they idealize Liu Bei and especially his loyalist minister, Zhuge Liang. In fact, Zhuge Liang would later be deified as a god of war. Another introductory element. I know this is taking me a long time, so this is going to be a long video, but I think the introduction is useful here because many of Du Fu's poems in this section, especially the 5 elegies on ancient sites, include some information about Zhuge Liang again. At least poems number 4 and 5 are also about this topic, so what I'm explaining now is useful for understanding those poems as well. Now, in the Tang Dynasty, especially after the Ang-Lushan rebellion, Zhuge Liang became a model, and it's very clear that in Du Fu's poem, he is seen as a hero, as a model, as the type of hero that is necessary for the empire at a time of civil war, massive upheaval and rebellion. After the Ang-Lushan rebellion, many generals that had helped save the dynasty, were enshrined, honored, And, this always jars, or this always jarred with the policy of most Confucian scholars. The tradition of most Confucian scholars, as we've seen all through these poems, is to frown upon the military as a class and about military virtues as such. It's the opposition of Wen, civil administration, virtue, and Wu, military administration and rule. So, for example, one of the things that the Tang dynasty had attempted even before the An-Lushan rebellion was to dignify a bit the military career. And so, for example, there were temples to Confucius and to the civil branch of rulership, if you wish, and the emperors had tried to create an equivalent for the military. They tried to make religious shrines for ancient, successful military leaders, the main one being Taigong, who had been the founder of the state of Qi, a successful military advisor to the first Zhou king, and also to Zhuge Liang, who was honored in these same temples. And, the army also had its own examinations for becoming an official, which were not the Ningxi and were less prestigious. But the scholar officials generally tended to boycott this idea of a temple to successful military officers and so on. But as I said, after the An-Lushan rebellion, people became more sympathetic, or at least up to a point, some scholar officials like Du Fu here become more sympathetic to glorifying a military figure like Zhuge Liang as an example of a successful general who, really saved his patron. And what else can we say about this? So Du Fu has, and others, but Du Fu especially, has a lot of poems about Zhuge Liang, and he had many friends who were generals, who contributed to saving the dynasty and who were not too well paid for their service, including Ge Shuhan and a few others. So when talking about Zhuge Liang, we might think that indirectly Du Fu and others are also talking of the other generals who saved the Tang dynasty. Remember, when Chinese poetry talks about the past, it very seldom is doing an archaeological exercise. It's generally raising past models and past events as exemplar for the present, meant to illuminate, criticize the present and what is going on in the present time. Okay, then, so after that very long introduction, let's take a look at the poem couplet by couplet. First couplet. For the Chancellor's shrine, where should one look? On the outskirts of Chengdu, where cypresses grow thick. So the poem begins with a rhetorical question. The poem, we know, is going to be dedicated to the Chengxiang, the Chancellor of Shu. Any member of the scholar official class would automatically recognize by the title that it's Zhuge Liang, the one who is going to be homaged in this poem. So the poem, as I said, starts with a rhetorical question. Where is the temple? Where's the shrine that homages the Chancellor of Shu? And it says it's on the outskirts of Chengdu, where cypresses grow thick. So this is pretty descriptive. That is where the shrine was. It was in the outskirts of the capital. And at the time of the Tang dynasty, it was pretty dilapidated. More than 500 or 600 years had passed since Zhuge Liang. And he did experience, as I just mentioned, a revival in prestige and reputation among scholar officials during the Tang after the An-Lushan rebellion. But, Chengdu is an important city, but Shu is generally a backwater place, extremely to the west and, not connected with the Grand Canal, the Huang River Valley and the Yangtze River Valley. So where is the shrine? It's in the outskirts. The cypresses growing thick are a significant reference because the legend says that Zhuge Liang planted cypresses. In fact, you will remember that the other poem by Du Fu about another of Zhuge Liang's temple is the old cypress, because of a cypress that Zhuge Liang had planted in that temple too. Cypresses are associated with Zhuge Liang. They are a perennial tree, like pines, and perennial trees are associated in the Confucian tradition with virtue, with permanent virtue in the face of adversity. As the analect says, only in winter can we really appreciate the greenness of the pine. That only when adversity comes do we really test people and see their true moral character. Okay, second couplet. On its steps, emerald grass gleams, wearing spring only for itself. Screened by leaves, a yellow oriole sings, its lovely sound unheard. So the first couplet located us in the outskirts of Chengdu. The second couplet, we're already at the temple, and the image that is given of the temple is a very dilapidated one. The temple is abandoned. This is probably spring. It's not clear. There's no really clear seasonal indication. Maybe the orioles or the green grass. But anyway, this is a dilapidated temple. People don't come here. Only nature, vegetation is here. So the memory of Zhuge Liang hasn't passed away, but his temple is not being kept clean and in full condition. It's rather dilapidated, like the empire after the Anlushan rebellion. So on the steps we see emerald grass gleaming. So it's wearing spring. It's showing the colors of spring, but only for itself, because no people come to visit the temple, so no one can appreciate the greenness of spring in the grass that grows in the broken, old, worn-down steps, or in the gaps between the steps of Zhuge Liang's temple. So this is a visual element, the grass of spring that nobody appreciates, and it's contrasted in a very well-crafted parallelistic line with the sounds of a hardly visible yellow aureole, the emerald yellow, the grass, the aureole, the gleaming with the singing, the wearing spring for itself with the lovely sound unheard. So it's the same idea. There's a yellow aureole in the temple, hiding among the leaves, but still you can gleam him from time to time. So you see this shiny yellow in contrast with the shiny green of the grass. He's singing, but there's nobody to appreciate the beautiful song of the bird, just as there isn't anybody, except perhaps Du Fu, to appreciate the beauty, the spring intensity of the green grass. There's nobody to appreciate the lovely sound the bird is making. This is an abandoned place, which adds, a very melancholy tone to the poem, in spite of Zhuge Liang being a great hero and one whose relevance to the present is understated quite clearly in Du Fu's poems. He seems not to be appreciated, and his temple has been abandoned or semi-abandoned. Third couplet. So now in the third couplet we move from the specific temple in Chengdu. In the second part of the poem we move to the historical figure of Zhuge Liang and a homage in words that Du Fu makes to him. So we're moving from the physical temple that homages him to the poem and to the words and to the memory of Zhuge Liang that Du Fu wants to homage. 3 humble, imploring visits yielded a plan for world order. 2 reigns he founded and assisted, showing his faithful heart. So this couplet summarizes the deeds and, the whole lifetime of Zhuge Liang can be synthesized in this couplet. Zhuge Liang was a man from the lower classes. Still, Liu Bei, who hinted, who knew that Zhuge Liang was a very worthy person who could really help him, paid him visits. And the legend says that he paid Zhuge Liang 3 visits to try to persuade Zhuge Liang to join his forces. And Zhuge Liang tested the resolve of Liu Bei by treating him a bit harshly and forcing him to come 3 times begging Zhuge Liang to join his forces. That's why 3 humble, imploring visits yield a plan for world order. Once the 3rd visit ends, the Chancellor of Shu becomes the Chancellor of Shu. He decides to serve Liu Bei, and he pushes for world order. He fights for his emperor and for stabilizing his position and his territory. And it says 2 reigns he founded and assisted. He founded, it's a bit hyperbolic, but not so much, because Liu Bei managed to carve a kingdom for himself to a great deal thanks to the ability and strategic savviness of Zhuge Liang. So there's 2 reigns he founded and assisted. He helped found the reign of his patron Liu Bei, but he also assisted in Liu Bei's worthless son on the throne. Liu Bei's son was corrupt and incompetent, or at least so says the legend, and his kingdom fell because of his incompetence after the death of, long after the death of Zhuge Liang. And while he was dying, Liu Bei was aware that his son was incompetent, and he allegedly had told his chancellor, look, if you see my son is not competent, I have no grudges if you just take the throne for yourself. But still, Zhuge Liang, as a paragon of virtue and Confucian loyalty, defended the worthless son and kept, during his tenure, the dynasty in Shuhan and the kingdom alive. So he assisted and showed his faithful heart. So ideal Confucian. Finally, the conclusion, the last couplet again. So in this 3rd couplet, we get a glimpse at the character and virtue and loyalty of Zhuge Liang. And in the last couplet that concludes, we get the end of Zhuge Liang's life and his being set up as a model for all times, a man for all seasons. He led the army out against Wei, but died himself before victory. At the thought of it, brave men will always shed tears. So he was very successful as a military commander during his lifetime, but he was not strong enough to unify the whole empire under Liu Bei. As we said, he was vastly outmatched in the resources of his kingdom as opposed to the vast resources of Wei and the not inconsiderable resources of the state of Wu. So he wasn't successful. And he was successful in many battles and in keeping his kingdom and in expanding the territory of Shuhan. But in the end, he died. And like Miocid in the Spanish tradition, he died, and the last battle he fought was won by his troops even after his death. So he is a shining model. That's what the last line definitely hammers in. Thinking about such a glorious and good commander is, a moving motif for all brave men in all periods. And he would be especially good model to imitate in the military chaos and warfare after the An Lushan rebellion. So he is a man to miss, to cry for, to long for, because we need that temple and that sort of men to put the empire back in peace.